The Galactic Assembly Chamber glittered with alien brilliance, its crystal walls alive with shifting light. Every delegate seated in a half-circle as the Zayari Council prepared their final announcement, their voices ringing with arrogance and mockery as they revealed what they believed to be the perfect humiliation for humanity. They would send their own princess, Liara, as a so-called joke bride, to a human officer, a gesture meant to reduce mankind to a laughingstock before the gathered empires, and the moment her name was spoken, the chamber erupted in gasps and low chuckles, because Liara was not only a royal, but also a symbol of her people's pride, known for her sharp tongue, regal bearing, and fierce contempt for weaker races. She stood tall in the center of the hall, her silver-blue skin glowing faintly beneath the crystalline lights, her posture radiating disdain as she fixed her eyes on the human representative, Commander Ethan Cross, expecting the predictable reaction of outrage or embarrassment, for surely no human would dare accept such an insult. Yet the silence stretched strangely long, the air heavy with expectation as all eyes turned toward the lone figure standing beneath the banners of Earth. Ethan was calm, his face unreadable as his gaze met hers, and for a moment it seemed as if he might reject the charade, as if he might storm out and thereby confirm the Zayari's mocking claim that humans were too weak and too proud to endure the ridicule. But then, in a voice quiet yet steady enough to carry across the chamber, he said, "I accept." The words struck the assembly like a thunderclap, and the laughter that had been building on alien lips froze mid-breath, replaced with stunned silence, as if the impossible had just been spoken into reality. Liara blinked, her composure faltering for the first time in years because this was not the script she had prepared for, not the reaction her council had predicted, and for an instant she felt as though the ground beneath her had shifted in some untraceable way. Though she quickly straightened, covering her confusion with a mask of icy control. The counselors exchanged looks, some whispering in disbelief, others smirking as if expecting Ethan to regret his words the moment the absurdity of them sank in. But Ethan did not waver, his posture firm, his tone measured, not defiant, not mocking, simply resolute, as if he had not been cornered into submission but had instead chosen freely. And this choice unsettled the Zayari more than any refusal could have done. Liara's sharp mind raced, assessing him with narrowed eyes, trying to discern what game this human thought he was playing. For she had been raised to view mankind as little more than a minor species clawing for recognition in a galaxy dominated by ancient powers. Yet here stood one of them, unmoved by the spectacle, unmoved by the jeers and stares, unmoved even by her, the pride of the Zayari. And that stillness, that refusal to break, stirred something almost like irritation deep within her. She told herself it was beneath her to care, that this was only a performance, a political weapon meant to degrade his people, and yet the calm with which he had accepted his supposed humiliation seemed to steal the victory from the council before it could even be celebrated. The chamber erupted again, not in laughter this time, but in murmurs, whispers spreading like wildfire among the assembled races, speculation tumbling from tongue to tongue. Why had he accepted? What did it mean? Was this human blind to the insult, or did he see some hidden advantage in what others saw as degradation? The Zayari Council attempted to recover their momentum, their spokesman declaring that the union would be sealed according to tradition. But their words lacked the smug power they had only moments earlier, as though Ethan's unexpected response had stolen the air from their sails. Liara kept her chin high, regal and untouchable, but inside questions she would not voice gnawed at her, twisting her thoughts into restless loops. Who was this human to look her in the eye without flinching? Who was he to accept what should have crushed him? For years she had believed her people's supremacy unchallenged, their cultural dominance unquestioned. Yet in a single sentence, this commander had shifted the balance, not by aggression, not by defiance, but by something stranger, something she could not name. The official proceedings wound down, the assembly still buzzing with confusion, and as Liara was escorted toward the chambers where she would remain until the formal rites were prepared, she could not stop herself from glancing back once at Ethan, who remained as steady as ever, his expression offering nothing, no triumph, no resentment, only a quiet strength that unsettled her more than mockery or rage ever could have. She told herself it was nothing, that humans were desperate opportunists, grasping at scraps of legitimacy, but the thought rang hollow even as she repeated it. The council believed they had staged a humiliation, but already Liara sensed that the game had taken a turn none of them understood, and she, unwillingly bound to this man, would soon discover just how dangerous humanity's quiet acceptance could truly be. The day following the shocking announcement, the orbital station hummed with rumors and speculation. The once glittering halls of the Galactic Assembly now filled with whispers about the strange human decision that no one had anticipated, and, as Princess Liara walked through the corridors flanked by her attendants, she could feel eyes on her from every direction, some curious, some mocking, and some even pitying, though none dared speak aloud in her presence, for she was still royal. Blood in her sharp gaze kept them silent. Yet within her chest she felt an unfamiliar tightness, a restless unease that gnawed at her composure, for she could not shake the image of Ethan Cross standing so steady, unbent by the insult that should have broken him. And the more she thought of his calm acceptance, the less certain she felt of her people's cleverness in orchestrating this charade. The council had meant it as a weapon, a humiliation so complete that it would echo through the halls of history, but instead it had left a question hanging in the air, like a blade suspended above them all. What if the humans did not view it as a defeat? What if they found a way to twist it into strength? Liara had been raised among the Zayari nobility, where every gesture was a performance, every word a blade, and she knew the power of appearances better than most, which was why she spent hours preparing herself for the formal union ceremony, donning the ceremonial attire of her people with movements that betrayed none of the storm inside her, her garments flowing silver threaded with crimson markings that declared her station and her pride. And when she stood before the tall mirror, she saw not a woman given away as a jest, but a sovereign daughter of the Zayari, who would not be diminished. Yet when she entered the grand hall to face Ethan once more, the stillness in his dark eyes unsettled her all over again, because he did not look like a man forced into a role. He looked like a man who had already chosen his path long before anyone tried to script it for him, and that quiet confidence shook her more than open resistance could have. The ceremony was conducted according to the traditions written into the Zayari codes, overseen by council members who spoke the words with a sharpness meant to remind all gathered that this was no true bond, but a performance. Yet as the vows were exchanged and Liara's hand briefly touched Ethan's, she felt a strange surge of energy, not physical, not magical, but something rooted in the calm steadiness of his presence, as though his acceptance had rewritten the moment itself, turning the farce into something uncomfortably real. And she found herself pulling back more quickly than she intended, masking the sudden flutter in her chest with a perfectly practiced frown. The gathered delegates expected laughter, but the silence in the room grew heavier, and for a moment it seemed as if no one dared breathe, until at last the formal declaration ended, and the council pronounced them bound, their voices clipped, their smugness dulled by confusion at the reaction their plan had earned. It was not triumph, it was not mockery. It was unease because the humans had not been defeated. They had simply stepped into the trap without flinching, and that defiance, quiet as it was, unnerved the galaxy more than outrage ever could. After the ceremony, Liara was escorted with Ethan to the private chambers assigned to them, an arrangement meant to deepen the humiliation. Yet once inside the chamber, away from the watching eyes of the assembly, she turned on him with a sharp glare, her voice like steel as she demanded, "Why did you accept? You were meant to refuse. That was the point." But Ethan only regarded her in silence for a moment before answering with the same calm tone he had used before, saying, "Because sometimes the only way to win against a game designed to humiliate you is to play it as if you were never afraid of it in the first place." His words struck her harder than she expected, and though she wanted to laugh, to dismiss him as a fool grasping at dignity, something in the firmness of his voice silenced her, forcing her instead to look away, unsettled by the way he seemed, to see beyond the walls she had so carefully built around herself. The hours that followed were restless ones, Liara pacing the chamber with regal poise, refusing to admit even to herself that she felt cornered by the shift in power, while Ethan sat calmly, speaking little, his presence heavy but not oppressive, as if he knew patience was its own weapon. And in that quiet, a dangerous thought whispered into her mind. Perhaps this human was not as simple as her people believed. Perhaps humanity was not so easy to belittle. And perhaps, just perhaps, the joke her council had crafted so carefully was about to turn back on them in ways no one could yet see. And though she dismissed the thought outwardly, burying it beneath cold disdain, the unease lingered like a shadow she could not banish, hinting that the true game had only just begun. In the days that followed the Union, the Galactic Assembly could not stop speaking about the human who had accepted what was meant as a humiliation, and everywhere in the Grand Station, the whispers grew louder, shifting from mocking laughter to a quiet unease, for many began to wonder if the humans had seen through the Council's plan all along, while others speculated whether Commander Ethan Cross had some strategy hidden behind his calm exterior. Yet through it all, Liara carried herself with the same regal posture she always had, though inside she felt the weight of invisible eyes watching her every step, as if she had suddenly become a living symbol of something larger than herself, something she could not yet control. And that realization gnawed at her pride more than she wished to admit, for she was no longer simply a princess mocked in the shadows of politics, but a figure whose every movement would be studied as proof of humanity's strength or weakness. Ethan, however, seemed unmoved by the sudden attention, going about his duties with quiet discipline, attending the assembly sessions without complaint, his calm gaze never straying even when ambassadors from other species tried to provoke him, with sneers or questions meant to expose his supposed ignorance. And the more he refused to be baited, the more their confidence faltered, until the same aliens who had cheered Liara's insults during the first day began to look away, unsure of themselves, sensing that something in the balance of power had shifted, and though none dared speak it aloud, the thought rippled through the hallways like an unspoken truth, that perhaps humanity was not the weakling species they had believed, but something far more dangerous, for only those who were truly strong could endure humiliation without breaking. Liara saw this change with her own eyes, and though she told herself it was irrelevant, that the humans would never rise to stand equal with the great civilizations, she could not deny the discomfort curling in her chest whenever she caught Ethan, watching quietly from across the chamber, his expression unreadable but steady, as if he understood more than he revealed. And when the council summoned her in private chambers, their voices sharp and filled with concealed panic, they demanded to know why the human had not collapsed beneath the weight of shame, why he had not raged or begged, why instead he had turned the council's mockery into a weapon against them. She found she had no answer, and that frightened her more than their anger did, for she realized that in binding her to this man they had tied their reputation to his, and every moment he refused to falter made them appear weaker. To regain control, the council devised new humiliations, subtle ones woven into the schedule of the assembly, assigning Ethan menial tasks in front of the galaxy's leaders, placing him at tables meant for lesser aides rather than dignitaries, forcing him to stand aside while others spoke, yet each time he endured it with a calm patience that made the attempts look childish, and slowly the other delegations began to take notice, whispering in private that perhaps the humans possessed a kind of discipline that could not be bought or broken. And this quiet respect, though unspoken, spread like fire through dry grass until even the proudest species could not help but glance twice at the human officer who refused to bend. Liara, caught between her council's demands and the reality she witnessed, grew restless, pacing her chambers at night as her mind battled itself, for she had been raised to believe her people's superiority was absolute. Yet now, she saw cracks forming in their careful image, and to her horror she realized that Ethan himself was not trying to dismantle them, but was simply being himself, steady and unshaken, and that simplicity was more threatening than any grand strategy could be, for it meant he was unafraid of their games. One evening, as the twin moons of the station gleamed pale light through the crystalline windows, Liara finally confronted Ethan in private, her voice sharp as she demanded to know what he sought, whether he wished to embarrass her people, whether his quiet strength was part of some calculated plot. But Ethan only shook his head and said softly that his goal was not revenge, that he simply refused to let others decide his worth, and that no matter how the galaxy saw humans, he would live with dignity. And those words, simple yet unyielding, unsettled her more than threats ever could, for they revealed a core of steel she had not expected from someone she was taught to mock. The next day, when the assembly gathered once more, the council prepared another spectacle meant to diminish the humans. Yet before it could unfold, an unexpected interruption shook the hall. The arrival of a new delegation from a distant frontier species, one that had been watching quietly from the shadows of the Galactic Order. And when they addressed the chamber, their first words were not directed to the Great Council but to Ethan Cross, recognizing his composure and declaring that they saw in humanity the qualities of true allies. And in that instant the atmosphere of the room shifted completely, for the galaxy had been forced to witness something the Council could not erase. A human mocked and diminished had turned humiliation into honor, and now others wished to stand beside him. Liara sat frozen as she realized the truth that her people had refused to see. The joke had failed, the farce had twisted back upon them, and humanity, through quiet endurance, had begun to carve out a place of respect in a galaxy that had once laughed at them. And though she still held her pride tightly, she could no longer silence the voice in her mind that whispered a dangerous truth. Perhaps the true shift in power had already begun, and she was standing at the center of it. The sudden recognition of humanity by the frontier delegation had changed everything in the assembly. But recognition alone was not enough to secure lasting respect, for soon after the announcement, the galaxy itself seemed to conspire to test whether humans were truly worth standing beside, and the test came not in words or political gestures, but in the form of a crisis that swept across the station like a storm. When reports arrived that a massive fleet belonging to the Cathari raiders, nomadic predators who had long terrorized border worlds, was moving closer to the neutral zone where the assembly resided, and fear rippled through the grand hall as delegates argued and postured, each species demanding someone else take responsibility, yet none willing to risk their own strength. And in this chaos the council saw a chance to trap the humans, suggesting, with carefully veiled words, that perhaps Commander Ethan Cross should lead a mission to investigate the threat, knowing that if he failed it would prove humanity unfit, but if he refused it would brand them as cowards. And so they smiled with hidden satisfaction, believing they had cornered him at last. Yet Ethan, after a pause long enough for the hall to hold its breath, simply inclined his head and accepted, his calm answer silencing even his doubters, and Liara, watching from her seat beside the council, felt a strange chill run through her, for she realized he was walking straight into the trap they had laid, and yet he did so without hesitation, as though the weight of the galaxy's judgment did not frighten him. Within hours, Ethan and a small human crew boarded a patrol vessel, far less advanced than the ships of the great empires, and set course for the neutral border where the Cathari fleet was last sighted. And though the council expected him to fail, word soon spread through the station that the humans had uncovered something the others had missed. The Cathari were not simply raiding. They were gathering in numbers not seen in decades, preparing for an attack that could devastate entire star systems, and the quiet dread this knowledge carried spread quickly, for if the humans had not discovered it first, the assembly would have been caught unprepared. Still, many dismissed it as luck, insisting that humans had stumbled upon the truth rather than earned it. But when Ethan transmitted detailed tactical readings of the enemy's formations, exposing weaknesses no one else had noticed, the whispers began again, whispers that humanity's perspective, born of survival on a harsher, less forgiving world, gave them an edge others had overlooked. And this time, the whispers carried a note of reluctant respect. Yet respect turned to tension as the council, unwilling to give the humans full credit, tried to claim leadership of the response, only to find that the frontier delegation openly sided with Ethan, urging others to listen to his strategy, and, in that moment, the assembly fractured, one side unwilling to bow to a so-called lesser race, the other swayed by the evidence that perhaps humanity had something unique to offer. Liara, caught between her duty to her people and the sight of Ethan standing steady before the storm, felt her own certainty waver again, and as she studied the determination in his voice when he briefed the delegations on the threat, she began to sense that the humans' real strength was not in their ships or weapons but in their refusal to shrink under pressure, a quality her own council had long dismissed as irrelevant. The assembly chamber grew louder, alliances shifting, arguments flaring, until finally the crisis forced a decision. A joint task force would be sent to intercept the Cathari, and though the council fought bitterly to prevent it, Ethan was chosen to serve as tactical advisor, his every move now under the galaxy's scrutiny. When the human officer stood at the command table of ships far larger and more advanced than his own, the fate of countless worlds hanging on his guidance, the council believed he would finally crumble. But instead, he calmly laid out a plan so simple yet so daring that it stunned even the seasoned admirals. A maneuver that relied not on overwhelming power but on timing, deception, and the will to endure risk, qualities the Cathari did not expect from their opponents. And when the task force engaged the raiders at the edge of the neutral zone, the humans' plan unfolded with precision, scattering the enemy and saving the border colonies from certain destruction. The victory shook the assembly to its core, for humanity had not only passed the test, they had done so in a way no one else could have, turning weakness into strength and revealing flaws in strategies that had long been considered infallible. And though the council tried to twist the outcome into their own success, too many eyes had witnessed the truth. Too many voices whispered of the human who had turned a trap into a triumph, and too many allies had already begun to shift their loyalties. As the task force returned to the station, the halls buzzed with the echoes of change, and Liara could not deny the storm within her own mind, for she saw clearly that the man she had once dismissed as a pawn was reshaping the galaxy one choice at a time. And though her pride told her to resist, another part of her whispered that perhaps fate itself had chosen her to stand beside him. And that thought, more than the council's anger or the galaxy's astonishment, was what unsettled her most of all. The victory over the Cathari should have sealed humanity's place among the stars, yet instead it threw the assembly into turmoil. For while the frontier species openly praised Ethan and his crew, showering them with respect for saving their colonies, the Central Council of the Zayari and their allies seethed in quiet fury, their carefully crafted order cracking under the weight of a truth they could not control. And so desperation began to creep into their decisions, pushing them toward risks they had once considered beneath them, for they realized that if humanity's rise continued unchecked, it would not only embarrass them but might one day unseat their power entirely. Rumors began to swirl across the station, whispers of secret meetings in hidden chambers, shadowy figures from rival factions slipping in and out under the cover of night. And though no evidence was clear, the air itself seemed to carry tension, as if the whole station were holding its breath, waiting for the council to make their move. Liara, though sworn to loyalty, sensed the shift before most, for she had grown up among those same counselors, had seen how they smiled in public but sharpened their knives in private, and she recognized the cold glances they now cast toward Ethan, glances not of rivalry but of fear, and she knew from experience that fear in the council's heart was far more dangerous than arrogance, for it drove them to act without caution. Meanwhile, Ethan continued his work with quiet steadiness, meeting with allies, reviewing defense strategies, and offering insights none had considered. And though he was aware of the hostility brewing, he carried himself as if he trusted that truth and merit would protect him. But Liara knew better, and it left her restless at night, pacing the private quarters she had once considered a gilded cage, but now saw as a vantage point into plots unfolding beyond the walls. The council's desperation showed first in their words, subtle at the start, as they began to question whether the humans' success against the Cathari had been exaggerated, planting seeds of doubt in speeches cloaked with politeness. But when that failed to sway enough of the assembly, they turned sharper, accusing the frontier delegates of being manipulated by human charm, and when even that faltered, they finally whispered of treachery, claiming perhaps the humans themselves had somehow provoked the Cathari threat to win glory. A lie so thin that many laughed at it. Yet a lie repeated often enough begins to gain weight in uncertain minds. And slowly, the assembly fractured deeper, factions forming not only around truth but around fear of what truth might mean. Amid this chaos, Liara was summoned by her kin, the very counselors who had once sent her as a joke bride, and they spoke to her in honeyed tones, urging her to remember where her loyalty belonged, reminding her of her bloodline, her duty, her honor. Yet beneath their words she heard the real request. They wanted her to act against Ethan, to find a way to weaken him from within, to ensure that humanity's rise could be slowed or even stopped. And when she hesitated, they pressed harder, warning her that her future would vanish if she stood on the wrong side of history, that her name would be cursed as a traitor to her people. She left that meeting with a storm raging inside her, torn between the weight of her heritage and the undeniable truth she had seen with her own eyes. The truth of a human who did not flinch in the face of scorn, who turned traps into victories, who treated allies not as pawns but as equals. And though she wanted to dismiss it as weakness of her own heart, she could not. For something deeper told her that to betray Ethan now would be to betray not only him, but something far greater taking root. While she wrestled with her conscience, the council made their next move, one bold enough to shake the entire station. They announced a motion to strip humanity of its provisional recognition, declaring them unfit for assembly status, citing fabricated evidence and hollow claims. And though many protested, the council used every ounce of influence, every alliance forged through centuries of control, to force the issue, driving the chamber into a storm of shouting voices, slamming, fists, and bitter accusations. The debate stretched for hours, tension so thick the air seemed to tremble until finally, in a moment of cruel calculation, the council declared that the only way to prove humanity's innocence was through a trial by ordeal, an ancient practice, almost forgotten, where a species accused must stand alone against a challenge set by the assembly itself, a test designed not for fairness, but for spectacle, a trial where failure meant exile from galactic affairs, and success meant survival. Against impossible odds, gasps filled the chamber, for many had thought such trials barbaric relics, but the council smiled, certain they had cornered the humans again, for who could survive an ordeal crafted by their enemies? Yet Ethan, standing at the center of the storm, did not shrink, did not rage, but merely raised his voice above the uproar, his calm words echoing across the hall. Humanity would accept the trial. Silence fell, disbelief rippling across the faces of those who had set the trap, and for the first time it was not the humans but the council who looked uncertain, for in their desperation, they had unleashed something they could no longer control, and Liara, watching from her seat, felt her heart pound with both fear and awe, for she knew that whatever came next would decide not only humanity's fate but her own, and she wondered with a shiver whether the council had underestimated the very spirit that made humanity impossible to break. The day of the ordeal arrived with a weight that pressed on every heart across the orbital station, for even those who despised humanity knew this trial was not just about one species, but about the future balance of power in the galaxy. And as crowds filled the great amphitheater that hung like a jewel above the gas giant, silence fell in anticipation of what challenge the assembly would unleash, a silence broken only when the ancient heralds announced the chosen trial. The Gauntlet of Varys, a test older than many civilizations present, where a champion must cross a labyrinth built upon a drifting shard of a dead world, a place filled with shifting walls, illusions, and predators engineered to destroy intruders, a trial where failure was not symbolic but fatal, and as the words echoed, many gasped, for few who had entered had ever emerged alive. Ethan, standing with calm composure beside Liara, did not flinch as the details were read. And though his uniform was plain and his figure unassuming compared to the gleaming armor of other species warriors, his steady gaze unsettled even the most hardened counselors, as if he saw not a trap, but an opportunity waiting within. Liara, though sworn by her birth to cheer for her people's dominance, felt her throat tighten with fear. For she knew this was not just spectacle, it was a carefully crafted death sentence. And yet, as she studied Ethan's face, she realized, with a start, that he did not carry despair but a strange confidence, as if he had been preparing for something like this his entire life. The trial began when he was lowered onto the jagged surface of the labyrinth, the sky above painted with storms of violet and green as the gas giant churned in endless fury below, and the walls around him shifted like living stone, rearranging, in patterns meant to confuse and isolate. Yet Ethan did not rush blindly forward but paused, studying the walls with the eyes of a soldier who had walked through war zones where survival depended not on strength, but on observation. And in that moment, the crowd leaned closer, realizing he was treating the labyrinth not as a curse but as a puzzle. The first threats came quickly, Swift predators that looked like a fusion of shadow and bone, creatures designed to overwhelm with speed. But instead of meeting them head-on, Ethan lured them into narrow corridors where their numbers meant nothing, using their own momentum against them, turning their attack into their downfall. And when he walked away unscathed, even some of the Council's allies muttered in unease, for they had expected a swift defeat. As the labyrinth deepened, illusions began to warp the space, showing him visions of Earth burning, of his crew abandoned, of betrayal by allies he trusted. And though the images were vivid, clawing at the mind with whispers of failure, Ethan kept walking, repeating under his breath the names of those he fought for, grounding himself not in pride but in memory. And while others might have broken under such mental warfare, his refusal to surrender his clarity became a story spreading, in the stands whispered from mouth to mouth, as if the labyrinth itself was being challenged by the very will it sought to break. Hours passed as the trial escalated, shifting from physical dangers to trials of endurance, searing heat followed by freezing cold, corridors filled with crushing gravity that bent the bones of the strongest species. Yet Ethan endured, his every step slow but unyielding. His every breath a defiance, and watching from the high seats, the counselors who had planned this spectacle began to shift uncomfortably, for the trial designed to humiliate humanity was instead becoming a stage for their resilience. At one point, when the walls opened into a vast chamber filled with an engineered beast the size of a shuttle, its eyes glowing like molten metal, the crowd held its breath, certain this would be the end. But Ethan did not fight with brute force, instead studying the rhythm of the creature's movement, its hesitation before each strike. And in the opening he discovered he led it into one of the labyrinth's shifting gates, trapping it within a sealed corridor before it could crush him, and the roar of the beast shaking the stone became the roar of the crowd above. For even those sworn to hate him could not deny the brilliance of his survival. Meanwhile, Liara sat frozen, torn between dread and awe, her hands clenched as she realized the man they had mocked as a placeholder envoy was shaping into a symbol of something greater than defiance. He was proof that humanity carried within, had a spirit no labyrinth, no predator, no illusion could bend. And with every victory he carved into the stone of that trial, he was rewriting the Assembly's perception of his kind. The ordeal stretched deep into the station's artificial night, and by the time Ethan staggered into the final chamber, bruised, weary, but unbroken, the amphitheater was utterly silent. Thousands of beings from across the galaxy watching in, reverent anticipation. And when he stepped through the last shifting wall and emerged onto the platform where the herald awaited, the silence shattered into thunderous noise. Cheers from the frontier species, gasps of disbelief from the Council's supporters, and an undeniable sense that something irreversible had taken place. Ethan had not merely survived the ordeal, he had transformed it, turning a death sentence into a story that would echo in every corner of the galaxy. And as Liara watched him raise his head under the storm-lit sky, she knew the Council's desperation had backfired, for instead of destroying humanity, they had given it the greatest stage possible to prove itself. And though the counselors tried to mask their fury with forced smiles, everyone could see it in their eyes. The fear that they had awakened a force they could no longer contain. The galaxy shifted in ways no one had expected after Ethan's victory in the Gauntlet of Varus. For while the trial had been meant to bury humanity under mockery, it instead had become the story that echoed across star systems, whispered in marketplaces, debated in council halls, and told around campfires on distant colonies. But the true change came not in applause or reputation alone. It came in the quiet return of Princess Liara months later, when she stepped from a human ship onto the Grand Council's platform, her posture proud yet her gaze unflinching. And the stunned silence that followed was not from her unexpected arrival alone, but from the undeniable truth that her once slender figure now carried, the unmistakable sign of new life. Gasps rippled through the chamber, for the Council had once sent her away as a joke bride, a living insult meant to humiliate both her and the humans, never believing she would truly stay by their side. But here she was, transformed, no longer a pawn in their cruel games, but a woman who had chosen her own path, and the child she carried was the living symbol of a union the galaxy had thought impossible. The silence quickly gave way to uproar, Some shouted accusations of betrayal, others hissed that she had been corrupted, while the younger races who had long endured scorn from the so-called elder species cheered openly, for in Liara's return, they saw rebellion against the arrogance that had ruled them for generations, and Ethan, standing quietly behind her, did not need to speak, for his presence alone spoke volumes, a calm anchor in a storm that no one else could control. The council demanded answers, their voices sharp with fury, accusing Liara of dishonoring her people, of bringing shame to the Ziyari throne, but she raised her head high and declared in clear words that she was no one's tool any longer, that she had chosen her bond with Ethan freely, not as a prisoner or joke, but as a partner. And the strength in her voice silenced even her fiercest critics, for it was not the trembling confession of a victim, but the declaration of a sovereign who had tasted freedom and refused to surrender it again. The chamber trembled with the weight of her defiance, and though the councillors pounded their fists and demanded her punishment, the truth was already slipping beyond their control. For outside the chamber the news spread like fire, carried on. Transmissions to colonies, outposts, and ships, stirring unrest among those long oppressed, awakening in them the thought that if a princess of the proud Zayari could defy her masters, so too could they. Ethan, for his part, did not make speeches or raise his voice, but when pressed by counselors who accused him of manipulating Liara, he simply reminded them of the ordeal they had set before him, a trial they claimed measured worth, and he asked them whether they now doubted its judgment when it had been passed not in his death but in his survival. And though they sputtered with rage, none could undo the fact that the trial's result was bound by their own laws. In the days that followed, tension gripped the station, with some delegations withdrawing in protest and others approaching the humans in secret, eager to speak of alliances, and Liara herself became a figure both feared and admired. Her every step followed by eyes that once looked on her with scorn, but now with wary respect, for she carried within her not just a child but a future that belonged to two worlds instead of one. And yet the greatest suspense came not from politics but from the quiet question hanging over every mind. What would this child mean? Some believed it would be a bridge between species, proof that walls of prejudice could be broken. Others whispered, it would be a weapon, a being of mixed blood who might grow too strong for the galaxy to contain. And still others feared it was the spark that would ignite a war no council could prevent. Liara herself felt the weight of all those expectations pressing upon her. But in the private hours when she sat with Ethan, away from the noise of scheming voices, she found peace in the simplicity of his faith, for he did not speak of the child as a weapon or symbol, but as their child, a life to be cherished, and that reminder anchored her heart when the burden grew too heavy. As the cycle of seasons passed, her return remained the most discussed story in every channel, her name spoken alongside Ethan's as if the two had already become inseparable legends, and the council, though it schemed and plotted, found itself unable to undo what had been set in motion, for no law could erase the sight of the proud princess standing unafraid. No decree could silence the whispers of hope rising among the younger races, and no punishment could strike Ethan without inviting the wrath of a galaxy that now saw in him the man who had conquered their impossible trial. When the day finally came for Liara to appear again before the council, further along in her pregnancy, she walked with Ethan at her side and her head held high, and though her people's elders glared with venom, the crowd that filled the chamber greeted her not with scorn but with thunderous applause, for by then she was no longer just the joke bride sent to mock humanity. She was the living proof that arrogance could be defeated, that walls could be broken, and that even in a galaxy built on centuries of pride and cruelty, the simplest choice of the heart could shake the foundations of empires. And as Ethan looked across the chamber at the faces twisted in fury and others lit with hope, he understood that the true trial had never been the labyrinth of shifting walls. It had always been here, in the hearts of countless beings learning. For the first time that change was possible, and in that quiet realization he knew their story had only just begun.